I've got an interesting guest today. His name's Gordon Pennycook. Small town Saskatchewan boy. Spent, I guess, most of his time in school just trying to crack the class up. But was always fascinated with psychology. I guess he was the friend you went to when you had a problem. And he went on and started undergraduate in psychology. Professor, third year, said, "You have an aptitude for that." And then sort of the lights went on. And Gordon started racing down this path. Graduate degree, associate professor at Cornell. And he's really trying to understand us and why we're inherently trusting as a human race.
If someone tells you something, you don't just immediately reject that as being untrue. Like it would be kind of like normatively inappropriate to just completely question everything that someone says to you.
But often lacking the skills to discern what is truthful and what is not, what is right and what is wrong, what is fiction and not fiction, news that I should share and news that I should ignore.
Getting people a little bit more aligned with the truth will make them more discerning. We're not giving them new information, it's just getting them more sensitive to the fact that they might be making bad decisions because they're not focusing on whether things are true, and they should be.
And that's what he's spending a lot of his time on. I think you'll enjoy this conversation because it is about you and I, and it is about the fact that we are under attack, that social media has given incredible powers to what he calls the elite and the people in charge of politics, and how they encourage us to lock ourselves in these castles with like-minded people and like-minded content, validating each other and finding purpose in loving what we have to say and hating what the others do.
It doesn't benefit a political oligarchic society with very wealthy political elites that are trying to control things to have an educated masses. Not just educated with knowledge, but educated for how to think and to question things.
Hi, it's Tony Chapman. Thank you for listening to Chatter That Matters, presented by RBC. If you can, please subscribe to the podcast. And ratings and reviews, well, they're always welcome and they're always appreciated.
Gordon Pennycook, welcome to Chatter That Matters.
Hello.
Gordon, I'd love to just claim some Canadian roots here. I know you're obviously an associate professor in an Ivy League school at Cornell, but just talk a little bit about growing up in Canada.
Well, I'm from a small town called Carrot River, Saskatchewan. My dad wanted me to work in the pipeline in Alberta in the oil fields, so I went into college without knowing anything about how anything works. And eventually I kind of get lucked into this third-year psychology course where a professor just said, "Hey, you seem to have some like aptitude for this," which no one's ever told me that at any point. And he suggested I apply for what's called an undergrad summer research award to the federal government in Canada. I got the award and I got into the lab. And that's how I actually started doing actual research. And they were doing research on human reasoning. And I actually was able to, for the first time, work in an actual academic, I wasn't doing labor.
How important was that third year professor that sort of knighted you and said you have an aptitude for this, that made you realize this could be the career path you were looking for?
Jamie Campbell, the late Jamie Campbell. In high school, in a small town, you get kind of pigeonholed into a particular kind of lane. And even in first couple years of undergrad, I had decent grades, but they weren't great grades. But then when it actually came to the actual research, I thought this is something that I can actually be good at. And then being pulled aside and have someone actually validate that was pretty remarkable. As I started progressing, I went to grad school at University of Waterloo. And one of my favorite stories is from my dad, who was very supportive. So I was defending my PhD, and it was very theoretical. It was about what are the cognitive mechanisms that lead people to what triggers people to reflect and deliberate. I had made no attempt at all to make any argument for why it's important in the world or consequential. I just said, it's just for the sake of knowing. What happens when you defend your dissertation is you do the talk and then there's a bunch of questions. And then you leave the room and then they deliberate as to whether you get your PhD. And so my parents were there and my dad came up and he said, "Yeah, that was really interesting. What's it for?" What do you do with it? Because he was a farmer. He worked at a sawmill, spending all this time, 6 years. And the culmination is just me talking about something that has no apparent bearing on anything. Seemed kind of surprising. Eventually, when I started doing work on misinformation, he started understanding why it's of use. But at the time, it didn't make any sense.
I hadn't heard about the class clown, but in some ways, this irreverence seems to come through. I mean, one of your I think the early name you made for yourself was tackling what you called bullshit, phrases that sound profound but mean nothing. Was that the beginning of you defining your brand within the psychology space, that rather than getting caught up in terminology that only a handful would understand, that you would start tackling terminology that everybody could embrace?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the kind of irony, I guess, is that even though after I had defended my dissertation, that was very theoretical and really was of no consequence to anybody, I had for a long time really been focused on trying to do stuff that would actually matter, or that could intersect with what people understood about how the world works, and that was not so densely theoretical or non-consequential that no one would ever care about it outside of academia. And so then I started doing work on stuff like religious belief when I was in grad school. And the bullshit thing, absolutely. I mean, you nailed it. Like, I don't spend a lot of time worrying if people think I'm using the wrong terminology. I try to make it so that it's accessible to the broader public and not just other academics. The irreverence part comes through.
I might have a bias on this, but I see the academic circles really living for affirmation from other academics. I mean, they live for their citations and they live for the nods, and that you don't seem to care about that. Your approach is much more, as you said, this intersection between real life and how people think, feel, and act. Has that caused you any issues within the academic world, or people just appreciate your sense of being granular and more honest and transparent?
I actively try to not be influenced by the prestige game and the competition that people have that's inane, and you can't ever win the competition because no one's smarter. Like, no one's going to produce more than Isaac Newton did. I just try to do good work that I think is interesting and is important. I think there are cases in which, if I was in my early days more focused on the game of academia, of like trying to publish in the best journals instead of just getting a paper that you think is interesting, I might have gotten to an Ivy League school earlier or something. I'm not sure. And by the way, it was never a goal of mine to reach an Ivy League school anyways. I just wanted to get gainful employment so that I could do the stuff that I love doing, which is the job. And then getting at a place like this makes it easier for me to do that. I don't follow a lot of I don't wear a shirt with a collar when I teach. You know what I mean? And and it's like there's a bunch of little things that kind of add up where I kind of eschew the stuffy academic norms. I'm not comfortable or familiar with elite spaces.
I write a lot about how social media has put us into our own castles with like-minded people, loving like-minded content, and you validate who you are by hating someone else. And one of the things that you challenge, and part of that, is this sense of partisan and fake news, that it's not that we necessarily match what our politics are. And I was curious how you could build on that, because I was always of the opinion that once they've locked you in this castle and the algorithms shape how you think, feel, and behave, very much it's validated by who's around me versus what I believe internally. Most
of the errors that people make are due to lazy thinking. They're not spending enough time engaging in deliberation and reflecting on whether their intuitions might be wrong, or just in general, whether the stuff that they're engaging with online could be erroneous or misguided or disinformative or whatever. There's a whole other kind of class of thinking about human error and that political bias that is way more focused on kind of like pointing fingers in many ways, where it's like partisan bias occurs partly because people kind of want to be partisan. They are actively kind of protecting their cognition from threats. And they convince themselves that the things that they want to be true are true. I mean, a lot of the studies don't find evidence for that, and I just don't think it's true. I think that most people kind of are trying to figure out what's true, and it's hard to do that, especially in a kind of polluted and confusing information ecosystem that we're currently inhabiting. How much has to do with social media and their understanding of algorithms, and where they can just sort of fly fish in the right headline or the right bait at the perfect time to get people to just jump in and either continue to validate this journey they're on, or if anything, have a rock that they can put in their slingshot and fire to someone else? Yeah, I mean, we live in an attention economy, in a context where the most precious resource is just someone's paying attention to what kind of stuff that you're presenting. That means you have to present something that will grab their attention. And how do you do that? Well, it's hard to do that if you're constrained by the truth. So there is research showing that false things have an advantage on social media. Once you take the truth constraint out, then you can say more things that will grab attention. And so there's a market for that sort of thing. And then there's also, of course, a market for things that are highly emotive that make people angry or create outrage. It's not that people want that. If you ask people explicitly, they're not searching for, false rage bait content. It's just that's what grabs their attention naturally. It's the same. And a good example of this is clickbait. The headline is something that makes it seem like it's really interesting. You click on it, there's nothing of consequence in the article. People hate it. It tricks them. They do click on it, but they don't want to see it. And so it's a decision for the company to say, this is something that we're going to allow on the platform. And what we've done is we've just kind of abrogated that. We said we don't really blame them, and that whole narrative has even shifted, where the social media companies aren't really being put to blame for the fact that they are taking advantage of the kind of weaknesses of our psychology.
You've countered with some habits that people can do to just spend a little bit more time, make us pause before we believe something or share something. What's your research showing that we should be thinking the average listener should be doing as they're scrolling through their social media feeds?
When people are sharing misinformation online, they often aren't even thinking about whether it's true or false. When you share something with other people, you share it because it's important, or that it might be, or maybe like something that people would like or whatever. And then like down the list is, wait, is it true? And so we came up with this like very simple intervention, was just subtly reminding people about the truth. Ask them a question about accuracy. We have little advertisements that were like, think before you share, that kind of stuff. Those subtle reminders improve the extent to which people are sharing true versus false stuff subsequently. So the message there is simple. It's like, just be more mindful when you're engaging online. It doesn't fix all the problems, but getting people a little bit more aligned with the truth will make them more discerning. We're not giving them new information. It's just getting them more sensitive to the fact that they might be making bad decisions because they're not focusing on whether things are true, and they should be more often.
When I look at, we always use Walter Cronkite, as the journalist that we all trusted and believed. But even within that newscast, there was a certain element of bias and U.S. propaganda. And it was only when they started showing the body bags at Vietnam War that people realized, that it wasn't all going so well for the Americans. So how do you counter? Because today, maybe the Walter Cronkite is a Joe Rogan. How do people come to terms with it? Because often they expect other people to do the curation and validation of what they're saying.
There is no context in the modern world where you can determine the truth for everything yourself. Very few of the things that you would believe are things that you can verify with your own experience. Everything is based on other reports, so we need trust. The problem is that there's bias, which is, presenting a kind of like particular angle on things. That's not inherently bad. I mean, there's like cases in which, like if you watch sports, the hometown announcers will have a bit of bias in it. You can understand that. It might make it a bit more fun, and you can appreciate that and take it into account. The problem is that if you have bias that is unappreciated or unspecified, you don't know that you're in that, and you think that it's just an honest accounting. That was the issue. Like take Walter Cronkite. There was imperative at the time for news people to be unbiased, and they were presenting a biased view, and that was the problem. Here, what we have is political news reporting. That the whole idea of being neutral is just completely evaporated. The other element, which is like, it has to be truthful. There are components of the like quote unquote news atmosphere that are not doing that either. Legitimate journalism, mainstream, they do a decent job of like, there's no inaccuracies. They don't like make up sources. They're not stretching the truth to such an extent that it's like, that's now untrue. But there are lots of like seemingly legitimate news sources that are essentially just parroting falsehoods. And that is even bigger problem than just a bias problem.
And I would argue too that today the people are listening to aren't just reading the news, they're putting their opinion behind it. How does somebody come to terms with the fact that, we'll go back to Joe Rogan, I don't think he's worried about sources as much as he's worried about his audience and providing the kind of opinions that people will go away with and say, did you hear Rogan and his interview with, and oh my God.
I think this is probably the worst development in the news ecosystem is the injection of opinion into news. So if you have a 24-hour news station, there isn't 24 hours of news, right, of events to cover. Unless, you might cover all the things in the world, but it's like there's not 24 hours of things that are worth covering. So in Canada, we have a 24-hour news station, but it's just the same hour of news repeated over and over again. It's not news for entertainment. If you go to the Fox News or MSNBC for 24-hour news, a very, very small amount of that is actual news. The rest of it is prognostication, people talking about events. That's just not journalism. It's just entertainment. It's not different than listening to Joe Rogan. He ostensibly is not doing it for news. Obviously, he's not a journalist. It's just people talking. And now people cannot distinguish between one and the other.
How much of it has to do with, I always call it the campfire. In the past, the vast majority of people sat around the campfire and listened to someone share a story. Today with social media, I'm expected to add a log to the campfire. I'm expected to have my own point of view. The logs I put on the fire is very much how I earn my likes. So is the problem, it's the people putting opinion to the news, or the fact is the reason why there's such an appetite for those opinions is other people feel that that's their new role in society, that they have to comment?
You know what? Actually, I think that people don't comment enough. Most people don't post hardly anything online. What you have are people who produce a huge amount of the content, often the people who are the least, not the people that you'd want to be listening to because they're the most interested in garnering influence in a social media context. There is feedback. You get likes and comments and you get but most people don't see the comments that other people write to the primary post. And mostly it's just likes and reshares and stuff like that. And so the incentives for the people who are generating content are basically perverse. It's the sort of thing that will generate eyeballs, attention, like I mentioned before. And in order to do that, you often need to be kind of salacious and make things interesting. A lot of people who read it, if they were to say something, they'd say that's dumb or I don't like it. But if you get enough people in front of it, then you'll get lots of likes. And so you have this trade-off where people are generating a lot of stuff. If people were giving their honest opinion, they would realize that most people don't like what they're saying. But because most people, if they don't like something, they just don't say anything at all. They don't get negative feedback. They only get positive feedback, and then they keep on going and it snowballs. So if people were more likely to fact check each other online, for example, then that would produce more accurate information that people are sharing because they wouldn't want to be shown to be false.
You know, you talk about the attention economy. In the past, it was monetized with TV advertising and television and radio. And but today, obviously, it's that money's disappeared from mainstream media and has moved to what I call the hairpin turn journalism. I'm waiting for something to happen, the crash, the sensational, the headlines, the doomsday scrolling. What happens to democracy, civility, society if we lose the kind of journalism that you're talking about, where it's not so much opinion, it's fact, and fact that makes people think? What happens if that disappears?
Well, we're seeing it right now. In the U.S., we're seeing backsliding of democracy, essentially, extreme levels of partisanship. If you add in the fact that there's two sides, explicitly sports, essentially, there's the red team and the blue team. And then you have all of this other people make a living off of the sport, off of increasing partisan animosity. And there's incentives for gaining attention. We lack disincentives for accuracy. I don't know a way in which you don't go from that to some sort of collapse or some sort of there needs to be some sort of change, some sort of substantial change. Positive is, the research shows that people do care more about the truth than they seem to. If you give people evidence, they will change their minds. People are more reasonable than we give them credit for, but they're fighting an uphill battle.
And you talk a lot about conspiracy theories. Is our appetite for conspiracy theories, is it increasing as we move into this world of social media where anybody can put anything? Or are we always, to me, I would have said the National Enquirer in the past and some of those tabloids used to see the grocery store with the two-headed Martian. Have we gone from being the sideshow and the circus to mainstream is really the norm for conspiracy?
So I don't think people's underlying interest has shifted. That's driven partly by what people are exposed to. The market is stronger. Conspiracies, if you remember back in the X-Files days, going back to when I was a kid, I was always fascinated by these paranormal beliefs and things like that. If you just watch X-Files, the conspiracy theorists in there, they're almost quaint. It's not like that now. That whole space is very, very kind of negative and in some cases violent. A lot of that is top down. People are feeding into it because it's benefiting them politically. Think about the election fraud. Probably the most widely believed conspiracy is that the 2020 election was fraudulent. Majority of Republicans still believe that to be true, and there's no evidence for it at all. Most conspiracies were actually fringe. That is not the case anymore. But that's not because people are more interested in the conspiracies. It's that people are being thrown constantly all these different conspiratorial ideas, and it's not. Once you're exposed to all that information, it's hard to kind of overcome it.
Some of your latest research with AI shows that you can sometimes chisel away someone's position in terms of their conspiracy beliefs.
The common trope that people have about conspiracy theorists is that they're down the rabbit hole because they kind of want to be down there. Even in the field of psychology, there's all this work on the importance of people's needs and motivations for why they believe conspiracies. And that people believe them kind of because they convince themselves that they must be true. And that explains why, like, they believe a conspiracy that's so flat laid against evidence, like the earth being flat and scientists covering it up. However, an alternative is that they believe them because they just like saw a bunch of stuff that was seemingly compelling, and they haven't seen good counter arguments because they're not in the right part of the information ecosystem where they get the other kind of side of the information. And so what we do in these experiments is we used artificial intelligence to provide individualized, highly informative counter arguments that were all evidence-based. And so people would write about a conspiracy that they believe in their own words, provide the reasons why they believe in it, and then they have a conversation with an AI. There's GPT for it with just some extra prompting. The AI just gives them like direct counter arguments for everything that they say, and then they say, okay, what about this? And the AI says, well, actually, that's wrong because of this and that and the other thing, and they keep on going back and forth. And after about like 8 minutes of that conversation, 25% of the people who believe the conspiracy don't believe it anymore. So that's a big shift. People you would have thought as like the key, like primary prototypical example of people who won't change their minds according to evidence. If you give them good evidence, they do change their mind.
Do they have an appetite? I can see it in a research circle and you're getting to do it, but is there an appetite for the average human to say, I want to be challenged?
We know that the people in these studies really enjoy it. I mean, it is the case that people who believe conspiracies, they like talking about them. And they also want to know if they're right. I mean, they think they're right. There's a subset, of course, that are like just unwilling to accept the possibility that they could be wrong. But if you give people, most people, enough evidence of, in the right sort of way, I mean, within the context of the conversation, people like it. Getting people in the door, that's the hard question. Getting them interested in even having this kind of detailed conversation. It's going to work for some people. Some people really do want to figure out the truth and they're misguided. Some people, it might be a harder ask, but we have to still tackle that essentially.
We come back, Gordon Pennycook and I talk more about AI, the good, the bad, and even the ugly.
Hi, it's Tony Chapman, host of Chatter That Matters. You lock your doors, you protect your valuables, but how about your online activities? Cybercrime has become a household word, one of the biggest concerns facing businesses today. A big shout out to RBC for creating The Vault, an online cyber safety playbook packed with tips and steps you can take to counter cyber threats. Visit rbc.com/cyber and download your playbook today. Helping you protect your online activities? Well, that matters to RBC.
If you're going to interpret whether something's true or false, you have to, by necessity, bring to bear whatever knowledge you have. And so imagine someone who only watched Fox News, maybe by accident of history, like that's what their parents watched. They don't really care about it, but that's what they're exposed to, versus someone who only listened to MSNBC. The range of things that are going to be plausible for them in the political realm is going to be way different, right? And it doesn't mean that they're being biased. It just means that they have a different basis of knowledge.
Those are the words of Gordon Pennycook. He's an associate professor at Cornell University, really making a name based on the premise of trust and maybe how we're too trusting. And you'll learn about some techniques and tools where we might spend more time thinking about what we're being offered versus immediately running to liking it and sharing it. You know, I've made an argument over the years in my social media that we've lost the middle ground where a lot of democracy and humanity and advancement happened. You know, it wasn't always perfect for one person or the other, but through consensus and collaboration. But I feel that middle ground's become this toxic moat as we continue to be imprisoned within our own circle of people that have like-minded beliefs. Do you think what you're talking about in terms of AI countering, challenging, will create some drawbridges to have people leave their castles and come back to the middle where they're much more open-minded to somebody else's point of view?
We're actually testing that now. If you can use the AI to not just like change what they think about a particular topic, but to make them more open-minded in general. That's harder, obviously. That's essentially a trait that people have, that people vary in how open-minded they are, how willing they are to question their beliefs, how intellectually humble they are. I think it's plausible. At the very least, one thing that we find is that people do trust the AI more and they're more interested in the conversation. So like in the more limited case, having one of these conversations would make people more interested in having more of them. And so that in a certain sense, that makes them more open-minded. But if more in a more general sense, we don't know yet.
Do you think the reason why the AI is proven to be so effective is it takes away the emotional side? So if I'm arguing with you over my position versus yours, it gets very emotional, and I stop listening to what you have to say, and the volume of conversation and the intensity goes up, where AI is much more pragmatic and logical?
When we've done experiments where people think they're talking to a human and it's the AI, and it works the same, it doesn't change anything at all. But that's still in a like anonymous, they don't know who the person is, it's not face to face, and there's certainly not like you talking to your uncle where there's a history and like all these things. That makes it more complicated. So that's partly emotions, but it's also partly like legitimate reasons that people would have to question the motives of the other person and all these sorts of things. And the AI doesn't have motives, it's just giving you information. So that's different. At the same time, we have done, and this was just brand new data, we did a version where it was explicitly a political topic, where there was like people were being persuaded that they were wrong about something that was political. And we made the bot to be essentially aggressive and rude. It was engaging in language that you would normally see in an online debate, be kind of flippantly like saying, oh, I can see why you might think that, but like obviously it's wrong. But then it would provide all the facts and evidence. And it didn't change the effect. It didn't actually undermine the effect because the facts and evidence were so strong that it didn't really undermine it. That doesn't mean to say people hated it. They didn't like after the fact. They thought it was biased. They didn't think it was a good source, but they still changed their mind to the same extent.
How does it counter? I mean, from what I learned in my basic psychology studies, cognitive bias is you can give me all the facts you want, the math, the language in the universe, and I'm still not going to believe it. What's changed with AI versus?
I think that's just wrong. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the dominant perspective in psychology on this sort of political motivated reasoning. It was a convenient story that one could use to kind of explain why people aren't as reasonable as the people doing the research, maybe. To me, there was like, and maybe this goes back to the earlier part, coming from a small town or whatever, I'm very resistant to the kind of elitism in academia. Like, I don't know what the appeal of the idea that people are more reasonable than we thought was, but part of that has to do with the fact that it puts less blame in the person for making mistakes. And I think part of the reason, like academically, in the terms of the research that people thought that was that they weren't giving them good enough facts and evidence. They didn't have the tools to really be compelling because the researcher. So if you're going to do an experiment where you're debunking a conspiracy, you have to come up with a conspiracy that you think people believe, and then you have to come up with evidence that you think would counteract the reason that people have to hold that. And if there's a mismatch, then you're not going to be very effective. And so, like, if you have this gap between the people who believe something that you're doing research on and the people who are doing the research, the academics, that makes this a problem. Now we can just bridge that gap. Turns out they're not so unreasonable.
I want to move to the negative side of AI that you talk about as well. But my last question before I do is, you really framed it as a sport. When politics is red versus blue in the States, who's the greatest of all time? Is it Wayne Gretzky or Bobby Orr? A sport that people love to have. They love to defend their point of view, and they want to get excited and energetic, and it gives them a sense of purpose, and it gives them a sense of my currency at this conversation or online is I have something to offer. Do you think that AI, which is obviously a very good debater and a very good organizer and curator and presenter of facts, will it get to the point where it's going to be neutered because people still like the gladiator element of the sport where I'm arguing with you, and it's less really about whether my sword is made of platinum or steel? It really just has my ability to swing at it.
It captures an element of sport, but what it's missing is sportsmanship. One of the most important parts of sport is learning what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. And part of that is rules, but part of that is just like, what does it mean to be a good sportsman? One of the kind of like underlying ideas of a democracy is that people debate ideas, and that's great. But it has to be debate with sportsmanship, which is where people are actively trying to actually get it right. It can't be just for the sake of debate. It has to be a debate for the sake of trying to get to the truth. It just so happens that like there's some research on like actual watching people do debates. It generally is not a good form, like a pitch debate, because the person is explicitly in a context where they have to win the debate and not in the context where you're learning from the other person to try to figure out what the truth is, using debate as a mechanism to figure out what actually is true. So I think that's part of the problem. That I think it is the case that they find entertainment from the partisan backlash. But I think it also goes both ways. I mean, people don't like it. I mean, in general, the poisonous political atmosphere is not something that most people view positively, even if there are contexts in which it might be fun to engage in a bit of debate. But I think we've gone so far beyond that. That's so infrequent that it's not really a consideration even.
But those in power know that it's not even debate. It seems like I'm after. I just want to dictate what I believe the truth is. And I want to overpower you with that. Even those in power that you would hope would have some decorum, some desire to be fact-checked, very often don't. They just come out with these statements that really are as far from the truth as possible. Are we just being, as a society, is this an element of submission where in many cases democracy is giving away to dictatorship?
I think so. What we want to be is debating the accuracy and the truth of what the political elites are saying. What they want us to do is to debate who's right or who's wrong amongst each other. That's the other side. You should hate the other side. And the debate is the battle between the two sides of this political thing, where really it's the people and the leaders, and we have to be assessing if they're doing what they ought to be doing, and they're doing things that are consistent with what the people who voted for them are actually want them to do. And that is not remotely what we're seeing. The political leaders are doing what they can to hide what they're doing and convince people to focus on all other parts. Putting troops in cities ostensibly is about safety within the city, where it's just obviously not the real impetus for that. It's about political control. None of us benefit from this. It's the people in power who benefit from it. The whole idea in the States is that there's this battle between parties, and that's all the fighting is between the Democrats and Republicans. But really, it's just between the extremely wealthy elite and everybody else.
And do you think, when you talked about earlier, the negative and positive, and the positive you found within the research, but the negative seen more intuitively in your heart, do you think there's a future for democracy?
I think part of the reason why the U.S. is still where it is that people are generally fine. You know what I mean? It's still a very wealthy country, but eventually that doesn't happen anymore. You can stretch the truth far enough until you have to pay the piper. It depends on how extended that window is of future for democracy, but I think there's a possible that there's some rock bottom that we hit. And maybe we aren't there yet, and maybe that rock bottom isn't for 10 or 15 years, but there's a rock bottom that we can crawl back out of. And this is the ebbs and flows of history. I don't know. Maybe the ebbs and flows are now more rapid than they were in the past, but I still feel underlying some optimism for the future of humanity.
While I have you, I also want to shift gears and talk about the negative side of AI. And you talk about AI swarms, for example, that could flood the web with fake consensus. And talk to me a little bit about what your research is doing in terms of how AI in the wrong hands are, in fact, putting even stronger strings on society in terms of them becoming puppets.
It allows you to automate good things and bad things. I mean, we've done stuff where we use AI to give people good facts and evidence. You can do the opposite. In fact, we have done the opposite. You can use AI to convince people to believe conspiracies, and that works too. And so it's just another component of a larger problem, which is our information ecosystem is becoming extremely complex and hard to distinguish truth from falsity. It is absolutely imperative to teach people the skills that they need, psychological skills, critical thinking, learning how to think analytically and question things. What's a good source? What's a bad source? Stuff like that. Digital literacy, AI literacy, all these things need to be taught, of course, to children as they're growing up. But we need to teach everybody because these are evolving technologies, and we are losing the battle right now.
Do you think we're teaching the right things to children growing up?
No. I mean, if we were, then we wouldn't be in the predicament that we're in. I think there's a lot of improvement that needs to be made. I think educators often talk about teaching critical thinking. That's good. But think about how much we teach math versus how much we teach critical thinking, like basic skills of how to question things. It's not close. And there are countries that do better. Finland, for example, has real classes that are about navigating the digital information ecosystem, and they are far more resistant to misinformation in Finland than we are in the States. The problem is that it doesn't benefit a political oligarchic society with very wealthy political elites that are trying to control things to have an educated masses. Not just educated with knowledge, but educated for how to think and to question things.
And where do you see this, the scams? I mean, I just did a study with RBC, an interview just talking about how vulnerable seniors are to cyber threats and bad actors. I mean, is that something you're looking at as well, that how it's becoming so much more sophisticated in how we convince people and how they're under attack?
Yeah, I mean, the scams are becoming more sophisticated. In some cases, they're even like, will do things where they are explicitly unsophisticated. Like the email will have errors, but that's done in a sophisticated way so that the people who click on it and go through and then they have to do all this kind of stuff to try to get their like bank details, they don't notice the errors. And so they're more likely to not notice that it's a scam, and it's all very, very complicated. It's with everything else, there's just less that you can trust. But our underlying psychology has not changed. Humans are inherently trusting species. If someone tells you something, you don't just immediately reject that as being untrue. Like it would be kind of like normatively inappropriate to just completely question everything that someone says to you. And so you need to teach people actual literal tools and skills, give them the tricks that they need to try to identify these sorts of scams and falsehoods on the internet. You have to put as much effort into teaching people how to fix them as the people are putting effort into creating the new scams in the first place. And there's a gigantic imbalance there.
And speaking of teaching, one of your courses at Cornell is called The Science of Human Stupidity. Talk to me about to what end?
People, I think, sign up for the course because they want to understand other people's stupidity. Because everyone thinks that they're smart and everyone else is dumb, or not, I mean, in general sense. And what I want them to come away with is for them to understand the nature of their own stupidity more, which is, where are the places that we make mistakes? Where are our own blind spots? How are we overconfident? The whole idea of the course is for people to engage in more self-reflection and to have the tools to essentially become better critical thinkers, people that are more discerning in the world. And discerning doesn't just mean, oh, I know what the true and the false things are that I'm seeing. It means I'm aware of the cases in which I believe something that is false or that might not be true. You are more calibrated and you have stronger, what we refer to as metacognition. You're thinking more about the way that you think. And that's what you need to be a more reasonable person in the world. And we kind of just like need that to happen for everybody. If we add a bit more reasonableness, that will shift the way that people are engaging with content, maybe change the incentive somewhat, and maybe get us in a better place.
You're a young person making a real mark in this world. And what's next?
There's a lot of this stuff that we're talking about is giving people tools to be more reasonable in the world. I guess it goes back to, my dad saying, what's this for at the end of the dissertation? To some extent, what this is for is to actually produce that benefit in the actual world. And some of that is, things like this, whatever, just telling people the stories and giving them the data, doing a book or something. But some of it is actually like building tools using things like artificial intelligence that people can use. We do have one website, it's called debunkbot.com. People can go and they have a conversation about conspiracies just to kind of test that out. But we're trying to do more versions of that sort of thing that are more accessible to people. I have no illusions that I'm going to save democracy, but if I can, mostly what I do is enough to convince themselves that I'm doing something so that I can go to sleep at night.
I always end my podcast with my 3 takeaways, and I actually love the way you just ended your sentence. I mean, what's this for? It's a great lesson in life for anybody to really talk about that to what end. What am I doing this for? What matters? How is it going to materially impact people? And if we did follow the work you're doing with some of your colleagues and spend a little bit more time thinking versus just absorbing and sharing, it might be the bounce back that democracy needs. The social media algorithms and the political climate are marching step in step. I no longer need a megaphone on the back of a train to convince people in the Rust Belt that I can do a better thing, that with these algorithms, I can be incredibly impactful at firing all their emotions for the wrong reasons as opposed to bringing them the truth. I love the sense of AI. It's about automation, good or bad, and it really comes down to the word protecting us. At times, it can provide us with the tools we need so that we understand really what the truth is. And there's going to be times where we need protection from AI because it's going to get more and more sophisticated at trying to either scam us or change how we think, feel, and behave. And again, the last thing is, which often comes through, is just how sometimes that single conversation, and in your case, third year university, and somebody said you have an aptitude for an individual like you, probably spent a lot of time cracking up the class and having fun and partying and just deciding what they wanted to do, realize that they might have a different purpose or calling in life. And I hope that wherever he is looking down, he's looking at you saying that was a conversation well spent, as I think this conversation today has been one well spent. So I really appreciate you joining me on Chatter That Matters.
That's my distinct pleasure. Thanks, Tony.
Now let's hear from the brilliant mind of Milos Stojadinovic, our cybersecurity expert from RBC. Just give us a sense. I know you're quite a modest guy, but you're very senior. I would argue RBC is one of the best in the world at trying to counter this. So just give us a sense of what you do for a living, and then I can ask you a couple questions.
My background is largely in what we call adversary emulation, or perhaps a little bit more informally offensive security. So I have built the majority of my career breaking into governments, organizations, defense contractors, you name it, and using my skills of offense to inform how we should design adequate and appropriate defense. So by attacking organizations and institutes, we understand where are their gaps, where are their weaknesses in their environment across people, process, and technology, and implementing that change. On the other side, I have a threat hunting team, which sets the hypothesis that there are threats inside of our environment. There are threats that are targeting our clients. They actively try to hunt for those threats inside of our environment and in our digital channels. And lastly, I have a threat modeling team that integrates the thought process of security into the products and the solutions that we build. So we don't think about security as an afterthought. We think about it as something that's part of the journey.
Do you ever think how much you could have made on the other side?
Yeah, I mean, you sound like my little brother because you ask me that question all the time. But look, the reality is that ethics is a large part in what we play, right? So in my role, I really have one thing. If you strip all my technical skill sets away, I have integrity. If I compromise my integrity, I obviously can't work in this industry. Right? Not to mention there's top secret clearances and all the other stuff that happens. But I have a deep desire to want to help people and protect people. I don't believe in victimizing people. I've seen friends and family around me become victims of cybercrime or even traditional crime. Like most people in life, I've been a victim of crime as well. So it's just, it's not in me, right? It's just one of those things I think you're either born to do or not.
So paint a picture for us. What is really going on out there? Because obviously RBC and all of your clients are all massive targets. So just open our minds to the seriousness of the threat.
15 years ago or so, if you wanted to target a company or target, someone of wealth, you had to know all this stuff about how to target them, right? You had to know how to do reconnaissance and how you might get inside of the environment and how do you persist in that environment and how you move around it and how you get access to the data. And that has become commoditized in many different ways. So these days, if you fancy the idea of being a ransomware threat actor and holding organizations for ransom, you don't have to know how to write ransomware. That's sold as a service now on underground markets. You can get 24/7 support, where you can literally talk to someone 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to get support for your malware. It's a big business model because what happens is the people who are authoring the malware, the ransomware, are taking a cut off of anything that the ransomware, their clients effectively are implanting. And then on the other hand, you have, for example, threat actors that focus on initial access brokering. So they may, breach organizations or even, people of wealth into their systems, and they just sell that access to the highest bidder. So if you don't know how to compromise and you don't also know how to write ransomware, but you've got maybe a sliver of that skill set, if you have the funds to get started, this is how you can kind of approach that. And that's why we're seeing the scale grow up massively. This is organized, it's sophisticated, and they're making tons of money. I think we opened up the conversation with this being a $10.5 trillion problem globally. And there's also increasing nation-state involvement and support in this, right? It's not unknown, for example, that if you live in a country that's non-allied with another country and you target their citizens or their corporations, you have virtually no chance of facing any consequence. And some countries actually even encourage that.
Is it fair to, because the other thing I was reading about is that some of those leaders actually also take a cut. $10 trillion is a lot of money to launder.
Increasingly, a lot of these funds are moving towards cryptocurrencies, right? They're not part of the same standard regulation, but these people can leverage that wealth to still, do what they need to do, purchase the things that they want to purchase, and that kind of leaves them largely outside of the regulated space that the rest of the world operates in.
Once again, a special thanks to RBC for supporting Chatter That Matters. It's Tony Chapman. Thanks for listening, and let's chat soon.